Okay, I'm here with Michael Jones, also known as Inspiring Philosophy. So, Mike, if you want to just take a brief moment to introduce yourself for those who do not know you and who are new to the channel.
Yeah, my name is Michael Jones. I run Inspiring Philosophy. I just got my master's in philosophy, and I do a lot of Christian apologetic videos here on YouTube.
Oh, great. Congrats, man, on the master's degree.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. So, we'll get right into it. We're going to talk about virtue ethics today. So, Mike, before you tell us what virtue ethics is, deontology and utilitarianism, maybe you could make a distinction between meta ethics and normative ethics.
Yeah. So when we talk about ethics, there's different branches of ethics. Uh, Meta ethics and normative ethics are interlinked, but they're also different in various ways. Meta ethics deals with our more underlying ideas, like what is the nature of ethics? Is ethics subjective? Is it objective? Is it cognitive? Is it non-cognitive? What do we mean when we say something, we ought to do the good? So it's more about trying to understand what ethics is, what we are doing with ethics, what's the nature of it. Normative ethics is asking questions sort of like on top of that. Once we figure out what ethics is and meta ethics, we then start asking questions about, okay, well, what is the good? What are we supposed to do? Are we, how are our actions to be directed? Are we to focus on consequences of our actions or on the actions themselves? So in a nutshell, meta ethics deals with the underlying nature of what ethics is, and normative ethics deals more about what we ought to be doing when we think about ethics.
Right, right. That was great. So if you could just go into the three dominant normative ethical theories, starting with virtue ethics and then deontology and utilitarianism.
Sure. The three dominant views would, the first one would be consequentialism, which a utilitarianism is a form of.
Mhm.
Consequentialism is essentially the idea that we need to focus on the outcome. So the rightness or wrongness of an action depends solely on the action's outcomes or results. So a utilitarian would say that, ideally what we should be doing is increasing something like pleasure or happiness. It's about the utility of an action. If it increases the greatest number of happiness for the greatest number of people, that action is good. So, should I, you know, think of an example here. Should I, think of the trolley example. Should I push the fat man over the bridge to stop the trolley from running over six people tied up on the train tracks? Well, utilitarian would say yes, because you're going to save six people. That's going to create more happiness. That's a good thing. Compare that with something like deontology, which says the rightness or wrongness of an action is based solely on whether the action is itself right or wrong, as directed by moral laws. So a deontologist, someone like Immanuel Kant, would say it's always wrong to murder an innocent life.
Right.
So go back to the trolley example. It's wrong to push the fat man over because in that instance, it's still wrong to kill someone, regardless of that it's going to save six people. So we got to, so these are the two views which are often contrasted in ethics, deontology and consequentialism, because they're coming at it from different angles. One is focusing on the actions themselves, and one is focusing on the outcomes of the action.
Right. Now, where does virtue ethics come into play?
So virtue ethics is a third form of ethics. It's the ethics I hold to. It's more of an ancient form of ethics. So it's what Aristotle would have taught is a form of virtue ethics. And virtue ethics focuses, as it is in its name, on virtues. So we should stop talking about what actions we need to perform and start talking about virtues.
Mhm.
So we should build a moral character. We should focus on being loving, courageous, kind. Once we understand what a virtuous character is, right action will flow from that. So we shouldn't have to worry about the rightness or the wrongness of an action. We should just focus on the virtues. And once we understand what the virtues are, then right action will flow from that.
Right. Yeah. So it's not about prescriptions. It's about cultivating a virtuous inner character.
Cultivating a
Mhm.
virtuous inner character. And it doesn't deny that prescriptions are important, but what it says is that prescriptions are secondary to virtues. Once you
Yeah.
have proper virtues, you'll just know what the proper prescriptions are to perform.
Right. And I've heard you say before that ethics is messy. And I think that's a perfect description. So virtue ethics is not necessarily saying deontology and utilitarianism are wrong, but they're kind of saying that they're just focused on prescriptions and the moral law and this intuition about the moral law, so to speak.
Yeah, a lot of the critics that argue from virtue ethics will not deny that consequentialists or deontologists make good points at certain
Right.
times. We just say that they're both incomplete forms of ethics. They're only capturing certain aspects of ethics. Sometimes you need to focus on the outcome of an action.
Mhm.
Sometimes we need to not worry about the outcome of the action and focus on the action itself. We
Right.
would say that the problem with a lot of modern forms of ethics that we see in consequentialism or deontology is they try to like simplify ethics down to just basic principles. You'd always just focus on this, not the big picture. As long as you have this one principle guiding your action, all actions will be fine. And there's oftentimes you can come up with scenarios where if you follow like a deontological principle or a consequentialist principle, it will lead to things that appear to be, or an intuitive sense, unethical.
Yeah.
So pushing the fat man over to stop the trolley seems unethical because you're actively trying to kill someone.
Yes.
You could think of the example of the sheriff against actually that's against consequentialism. I think the sheriff example. But you could think of things like, for example, this was an objection raised against Immanuel Kant, that if it's always wrong to lie, if someone shows up on your doorstep and says like, please point me in the direction of your family so I can axe murder them, you'd be like, well, it's probably the most virtuous thing in that instance to lie to that person because absolute horrible things are going to result. So it's this idea that perhaps deontological systems, consequentialist systems are just sort of looking, or they're simplifying ethics in ways that they shouldn't. And really ethics is messy, it's complex. There's a lot of different actions that we're going to have to perform throughout life. You can't really simplify all your actions to one principle or another, or just a few couple principles to guide your action. There's a lot you have to focus on.
For sure. And you even think of an example like Hitler or Stalin. It may be virtuous to kill Hitler in certain respects. You know what I mean?
Well, even there's a book called The Pope's Secret War, where the Catholic Pope at the time gave the blessing to the German resistance, and you can kill the Pope. It's not, or you can kill the Hitler. It's not a problem. Go and kill him. Fine, whatever. He's an evil guy. Just kill him.
Yeah, it just depends on the situation. It's largely situational ethics a lot of times.
Correct.
Okay, so question 2, Mike, how is virtue ethics and Christianity similar?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about virtue ethics so we understand a little bit about that. So virtue ethics is this idea that you have to focus on these virtues. How do you learn what virtues are? Well, you imitate the phromenos, the expert in ethics. You learn from a virtuous teacher, someone who understands ethics. You imitate him, you follow him, you do what he does, and you basically learn the skill of virtue. And once you sort of learn that skill, so to speak, then you know how to act. It's like following a plumber. And learning from one. If you spend a couple weeks training under a plumber, you're going to know what to do if a pipe bursts.
Right.
You may never have encountered that situation before, but because of your previous training, you're going to know, okay, well, I need to apply this tactic and that tactic. You just sort of learn the skill of plumbing, even if you don't know, even if you've not been trained in every circumstance. Likewise, that's what it's like with the skill of virtue, is that once we sort of study it, we'll know what to do. We may not know how to be loving in every situation, but if we understand what love is, we'll know how to apply that virtue to various circumstances. Now, just hearing that, it already starts to sound a little bit like Christianity, because Christianity very much focuses on the fruits of the Spirit. Be loving, joyful, patient, peaceful, kind. Focus on these things, because Paul says against such things there is no law. If you have these virtues, you won't need a law to tell you what to do. You'll just have the virtues you need, the fruit of the Spirit, and you'll just act accordingly. The New Testament also places a big focus on imitating Christ. That's the whole focus of why Jesus became flesh in Christianity. God became man to show us how to live properly. Imitate him. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Jesus said, imitate the Good Samaritan from his parable. This idea of imitation is very central to the idea of Christian ethics. It was taught a lot by Paul. The Gospels were written so we know how to imitate Christ, to follow after him, to live like he lived, to love like he loved. So right then and there, it very much seems that Christianity is teaching its own form of virtue ethics,
Mhm.
which is important because a lot of modern writers, a lot of modern Christian writers like Norman Geisler, have argued that Christianity taught a form of deontic ethics. And I just don't think that's accurate.
Right. Yeah. And as Paul has said before, too, you become a law unto yourself. So you can't just sit back and think about these abstract moral principles. You have to actually go out into the world and act out these kinds of things.
Well, the funny thing is, when he said that, he's actually quoting from Aristotle's Politics.
Mm.
Against such things, there is no law in Galatians chapter 5.
Right.
So, right then and there, we see that he was influenced by Aristotelian thought.
Mhm.
So, he's very much teaching a form of ethics that's similar to what Aristotle was laying down.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so question 3, would you say that Jesus was a virtue ethicist?
Yeah, in its own sense. So, he would
Mhm.
not have said that because this is a modern phrase that we have coined. No one in the ancient world would have said that. But if we were going to classify him, it definitely would be a virtue ethical framework that he is sort of laying down. And I think that's clear when he does things like he teaches through parables, imitate the good characters in the parables. He teaches through his own actions, like do as I do, teaching his disciples to follow him, to take up your cross and carry after him.
Right.
This idea that he is the virtuous teacher who has sort of come down from heaven with the right wisdom. And now the proper thing to do is to imitate him, love as he loved, live as he lived. He has commanded that we go out and be his body in that sense. So he very much would have been laying down a type of ethics that is very similar to a virtue ethical framework. And then Paul, of course, picks up that mantle and goes really far with it as well.
Right. Yeah, even Sermon on the Mount, seems pretty akin to virtue ethics.
Yeah, because it's focusing very much on the virtues you need to have. It's not just good enough to not commit adultery. You need to have the idea in your heart that it's wrong
Yes.
to even think lustfully.
Right.
It's not just good to, it's good you shouldn't murder, but just performing that action is not good enough. You also know that you have the right idea in your heart that it's wrong to hate someone.
Right.
And when he criticizes the Pharisees in Matthew 23, he refers to them as whitewashed tombs. Like they do all these good things on the outside, but on the inside they lack the virtues. They lack the good moral character that they're supposed to have.
Okay, so question 4, this is an interesting one. What is God's ultimate aim? So for me, I think we often presuppose that God's aim toward humanity is kind of a utilitarian aim. He's interested in maximizing pleasure and happiness. And I think that's important in God's eyes, but I think that comes secondary. I think what he's first interested in is this idea of virtue, something akin to virtue ethics, developing virtuous creatures through soul building. So what do you think about that?
Well, yeah. Well, let's first note that maximizing happiness is not a bad thing. Virtue ethicists are not against that utilitarian idea.
Right.
We just would say that that doesn't make everything else good. So, like certain virtues, according to utilitarians, are only good in the utility they provide. And an analogy I remember one of my professors gave me was think of a garden. You could say there's all these different things in the garden, different flowers, but you wouldn't say the azaleas are only good because of how they make the daffodils look, or the sunflowers are only good because of how they make the daffodils look. They're good in their own right.
Right.
So the virtues can be good in their own right, divorced from the utility they provide, but they can also be good because of the utility they provide. It's not one or the other.
Yeah.
So we would agree that God wants to maximize happiness, but we would say that God understands he can't do that until we have become virtuous creatures. Because if we are like we are now and we maximize happiness, our happiness will be maximized with vices in us, idols that we worship, certain things that we have built our identity on that we call sin. So that sin needs to be cleansed. We need to be sanctified and made into phromenos as people who understand the virtue, who live by virtue, who are guided only by virtue, not by vices. So God is going to work now to maximize that as much as possible, and so that we can have true happiness in the long run. So it's this idea that it would be nice if we could live in a perfect world, but we're just not ready for that yet. We need to be changed. We need to go through periods of suffering so that we can be purged of our sins or of our vices, so that we can become a phromenos. And then when we're a phromenos, Framanos is just a virtuous person who understands virtue. It's a term I believe Aristotle used to describe the virtuous person that you should be imitating. So when we become the Framanos, then we'll experience true lasting happiness that could
Right.
last for eternity. Right now, we just can't do that. We have to experience bouts of suffering as part of our growth to get to that point.
So, Mike, would you say that suffering is therefore necessary in a sense? Because for me, it doesn't seem like suffering makes sense on any other paradigm but virtue ethics. You know, if God's ultimate aim is just maximizing pleasure and happiness, then he could have just created pleasure robots. You know,
yeah, I think it makes it on views like utilitarianism that makes sense. But I think Justin Mooney, for example, who's another philosopher, noted that you can make suffering is compatible with a deontological view. So he has a paper on that, which he talks about that. But I think it does fit very well with the virtue ethical framework. Because if you think about certain stories that you love, my favorite story, of course, is Lord of the Rings. Would a better story be Lord of the Rings, or a story where the ring was destroyed long before Frodo was born, and the entire book is just Frodo going about his daily business, having tea, having second breakfast? I mean, we would be like, that'd be good, but it wouldn't be a triumphant, amazing story filled with overcoming evil. And the point the virtue ethicists can make, the Christian virtue ethicists, is that the really, really good virtues can exist in a world without evil, but the maximal amount of virtues cannot without triumphing over evil, without defeating suffering, going all the way to Mount Doom, experiencing the maximum amount of suffering, getting there, and then finally being victorious over the evil. Because without suffering, without danger, you can never experience the virtue of being courageous. We cannot experience compassion unless there's sorrow. What was that?
Patience.
Really,
anything, you know. Let me see what I was.
So we'll just to add to that. I mean, you got to think about what is a more interesting Frodo? Frodo that never has to experience any suffering and just wants a spoiled life in the Shire, or Frodo who got stabbed by the Nazgul, went all the way to Mount Doom, came back and was a new and changed person who truly understand how good he had it there. I think we would all agree that the second Frodo, and you could think about it as any story. You could do Star Wars, you could do the Marvel movies. We all realize the triumph of those stories is what makes the story itself. It's what makes really good characters. So why wouldn't God want the same thing?
Yeah, exactly. And that suffering seems to be necessary in a sense to, like you said, to really be a self and to overcome obstacles and to face trial and error.
And what's interesting is that's even what God does with himself when he becomes Christ. He overcomes evil. He lives the human experience where Paul says he humbles himself, becoming a slave, living a human life by that limited human experience to overcome and defeat evil in that human form. So even God realizes that's better to go through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we develop virtues in a world without any suffering at all? So we kind of touched upon that a little bit, but if you want to expand on it.
Yeah, of course we could develop virtues without any suffering, but we could not develop what I would call triumphant virtues. We could not develop the really deep, rich character that I think God wants us to have. Which God appears more loving? A God that sits on his throne, like Allah, the God of the Muslims, or the God of Christ, who comes, lives the human life you should have lived, dies the death that you deserve, and then rises from the dead to live eternally so that you can have a perfect relationship with the Father. That God, I think, by any standard, just appears more loving, more interested in us, more willing to unite himself to us. Not some distant God who just sits on a throne, never has to experience real suffering, real pain and remorse. I think it's just clear that creates a much deeper sense of love. So I think when we realize that if God is going to create a certain type of world, he's going to create a world where evil is allowed to come about so that it can be defeated through triumph. And when it does, it creates a far more interesting world with more interesting characters, with more interesting stories. And I think we agree with God subtly when we make movies, when we write books, because we don't
Yeah,
write books
that's
and
interesting.
movies about the Care Bears.
Even songs, songs, yeah, Care Bears.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
always
we
have that law of triumph is always interwoven within really anything and everything,
correct,
It's
correct.
always
We
this
want to.
overcoming.
It's always this overcoming, and when we
Mhm.
write our own stories, our own about our own worlds, it's always about defeating some sort of evil in that world. So it seems like we subtly agree with God that
Mhm.
if we were going to create a world, we're going to create a world with suffering that can be overcome. But then at the end, then we turn around and make the problem of evil from
Mm.
a skeptical perspective to attack the existence of God. But then we subtly admit that God is sort of right by the own worlds we create.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's certainly an interesting perspective. So, just to backtrack a little bit, if there was a world devoid of suffering, we would still be able to develop virtues. That's what you're saying, right? But they,
Absolutely.
okay, okay,
And not, you wouldn't be able to develop every virtue like courage or
right.
compassion, I feel.
Hmm.
How can you be compassionate for someone if they've not actually experienced any sort of suffering or pain?
Exactly. Or courageous if there's nothing to, you don't have to be courageous in a
Mhm.
certain situation.
Yeah, even things like you mentioned earlier, patience. If there's
Yeah.
no suffering, how can you experience the virtue of patience? Because patience is this idea that you have to sort of reserve yourself to not
Hmm.
experience suffering within, because maybe someone else is too slow at something, or they're taking too much time of your time.
Yeah. So,
So that's a form of suffering in some way.
yeah, absolutely. And some of these virtues seem like a necessary precondition before the next life in God's eyes. Would you agree with that? Things like courage, patience, like we just mentioned.
Yeah, if that is true, that we're going to become Fraumenos, I guess is a word,
Yeah.
sort of like a spiritual state above the angels, perhaps, in our resurrected bodies.
Right.
Then yeah, God would want us to be proper lords over creation. So I'll say this is speculative, but my view of the eschaton is that when we are resurrected, it will be our job to turn the whole universe into Eden. So we will start on Earth and turn it into Eden as it was supposed to be. Then we'll move to maybe the moon or Mars, Venus, moons of Jupiter, move out to other solar systems until the whole universe is Eden. That I think that now, of course, that's speculative, as I said, but
Mhm.
this idea, it's still this idea in Christian um, theology is that we're supposed to be sort of like lords or the God's image and be lords over creation in God's name.
Mhm.
That starts off in Genesis. But so if that's what we're supposed to be, I think we need to be prepared properly to be proper rulers of creation. We have to go through suffering. If you look at the stories, whoever makes the best kings in the stories are the ones who went through some sort of suffering.
Right. That's a good point.
They've had gone through some sort of trial that have made them into because they've experienced the common man's suffering of some regard. The only thing that's popping in the mind for some stupid reason is Jon Snow in Game of Thrones, even though he doesn't end up as king. But you get this idea that he is a proper true leader because he lived a life where he was humiliated as a bastard. He was attacked, and he served as a watchman on the wall. He is a true proper king because he understands what it's like to go through suffering.
Yeah.
He was not a spoiled Joffrey who
Right.
was raised in a royal house and he just gets to torment people whoever he wants. But you can think of other examples where they're like someone rises to the throne who truly does deserve it.
Yeah. I think if you just ask anyone too, what has been the most pivotal point in your life, they're always going to bring up something where they overcame a certain situation all the time, not
Mhm.
just, oh, it was just when I was in my hedonistic trip or whatever. It's always this kind of overcoming, job
Right.
promotion, maybe graduating from a master's degree. I mean, you went through suffering. That wasn't obviously gratuitous, horrific suffering, but you still went through suffering. You made a lot of sacrifices and you emerged from that program, you know?
Right. And I think that's important to say because a lot of times people say that is the most defining character quality of them.
Yes.
But then some skeptics will turn around and make the problem of evil or the problem of suffering against the existence of God. And it's like, well, wait a minute. If the world you're proposing was real, you wouldn't exist. You, in the current state you are now, you
Mhm.
would not be you because you would not have had those experiences, those hard, rigid experiences that really shaped you into the person you are now.
Yes.
So do you
Yeah.
truly want to live in a world without suffering? Because you technically would not be there to exist. A Care Bear version of you would be there to exist, or a spoiled Joffrey would be there to you to exist. And it's true. People talk of, I can think of the most defining characteristics of my life have been times where I've gone through trials and sufferings. It seems necessary to create character developments like we to turn us into what we are, what we're supposed to be.
Totally agree. Yeah, I mean, even me, I play guitar. I've been playing guitar for around 8 years. And if you were to ask me what is the greatest moment of playing guitar, I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, when I learned this specific song or this specific riff. It's more so, I will go back to when I was developing calluses and my fingers hurt, and I was growing and learning along the way. And that's where I really, find meaning in learning the guitar. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a long history of Christian tradition that unfortunately we have a lot of Protestant circles have forgotten. But it's this idea that the Christian is supposed to embrace suffering, that the life of a life of suffering is good because you
Mhm.
realize it brings you closer to God, and it also makes you into the Framanos, makes you into such a virtuous person that's who Christ wants you to be. You get to unite with Christ in your suffering.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the early Christians understood something that we have forgotten today, which is how important suffering is and how much of a good it can be for the utility it provides.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what makes Christianity unique too. Stoicism is just kind of, go through the suffering, not white knuckle all the way through it. Whereas Christianity it's all about suffering and that law of triumph and growing through suffering. Whereas in other religions too will try to evade suffering. They think it's absolutely horrible, try to escape the world in a sense. But Christianity affirms that suffering.
Mm-hmm. It's unfortunate that a lot of Protestant traditions have forgotten that and are now pushing
Yeah.
things like prosperity gospel. When it's
Mm,
just when I hear that, it just sounds so divorced from what Christianity is. It makes
mm.
me pull my hair out.
Yeah, for sure, man. Okay, so the last couple questions here. What are some core virtues that we should develop? We kind of touched upon them, but maybe we could talk about some vices that we should absolutely avoid as well.
Yeah, so I think Galatians 5 really lays down what the core virtues need to be: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self control. Now, you could add other virtues in there, like courage was very big for Aristotle. I think that's also a virtue we should obtain. But
Hmm.
I would say the core virtue of all is love. I think love needs to be the guiding feature of our life. And of course, I'm speaking from my Christian tradition, but I think a lot of people today agree
Oh
that
yeah,
at the
for
core
sure.
of everything, we need to be loving.
Hmm.
Now, that's important because being loving is this, some people equate being loving with being nice or affirming.
Yeah.
There's something called tough love. Sometimes you have to insult someone, and that's the loving thing to do.
Hmm.
People don't like to hear that, but that's what Jesus did. That's what Paul did throughout Galatians. He insulted the
Absolutely.
Galatians, where he talked where in the same letter he said, to fulfill the law is to love thy neighbor as thyself. And in that exact same letter, he's insulting the Galatians. So sometimes you got to be tough. Sometimes you got to be hard on people. Being loving is not always about being nice. It's about doing what's best for that person, regardless if they think it is the best thing or not. So
Yeah,
I think the
absolutely.
core virtue of all is love.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Well, that wraps it up. This was a shorter discussion, but I think it went really well. So, Mike, I want to thank you so much for coming on the channel, and I hope we can chat again soon.
Yeah, keep it short. That way more people will watch it.
Absolutely. All right, Mike, take care.
Thank you. Take care.